Hello, my name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. Thanks for joining our Security Outcomes Deep Dive webinar series. In this series, we will examine in more detail each outcome in our Identity-Defined Security Outcome Library. Members of our technical working group team who develop the outcomes will join me to discuss the goals of the outcome and the various implementation approaches. So my guests today are Chris Hills and Chris Arnold. Chris Hills, who we will from now on be referred to as Chills, has more than 15 years experience as a senior security and architecture engineer operating in highly sensitive environments. Chills is a military veteran of the United States Navy and started with BeyondTrust after his most recent role leading a privileged access management team as a technical director within a Fortune 500 organization. In his current position, he has assisted the sales engineering organization, consulting on PAM implementations, and now reports to the Office of the CTO as Deputy CTO. Chris Arnold, who will from now on be called Chris, is the Vice President of Development for Avatier, leading all things development for the Avatier Identity Anywhere solution. He manages an international team that focuses on innovation and GUI design to provide a seamless user experience. He works closely with the team to define business strategy and building the technology roadmap for the products and services that continue Avatier's success. Prior to Avatier, Chris focused on delivering ERP and security solutions globally for PeopleSoft, Oracle, as well as his own consulting company. So Chills and Chris, it's great to have you guys here today.
Thanks, Julie.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Julie.
Appreciate the opportunity to come and actually share in this experience, especially with the outcomes that we had an opportunity to help the IDSA participate in.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
I'm excited to be able to once again just talk about some of the things that we're doing in the industry and how excited we are to see how some of these outcomes can help our customers as well as others out in the industry.
Great. So before we dive into the fun of today's security outcome, I want to share a little bit about the IDSA. And if you're already familiar with the IDSA or have listened to another webinar in the series, you can skip ahead about 6 minutes to get to the meat of the discussion. So the IDSA exists to help organizations with the key challenges they are facing today. It's no secret that cybersecurity has become cumulatively challenging. Threats and vulnerabilities are a moving target. New technologies and defense mechanisms are introduced daily, and now with COVID-19, our traditional work environment has been turned upside down. Most organizations have been collecting identity and security tools over many years, solving the threat of the day, week, or year. A single tool, single vendor approach is just not working, as you can see from the last challenge. The number of identities organizations manage and secure has exploded in the last 5 years, and the risks associated with those identities has as well. In our latest research, which I'll talk about a little bit later at the end, we found that 79% of organizations had suffered an identity-related breach in the last 2 years, which all leads us to the need for a new approach to security. So identity has moved beyond an operational function and should now be considered a critical cybersecurity technology. It's important to recognize that every business transaction, attack surface, or target involves a credential and a service or piece of data. And we can no longer sustain a one problem, one tool approach. Cybersecurity technologies must fundamentally work together if they are to achieve meaningful effectiveness. And lastly, we must operate with the mindset that the total investment must make the whole more effective. We must share the intelligence, the identity context across the entire enterprise technology stack. Most people think that identity is really hard, but the good news is that identity technologies have come a long way in the last 5 years. They are becoming easier to deploy and maintain, and the identity and access management technology segments, which you can see here, from our membership, are working better together, and integration between identity technologies has improved as well. So our goal is to help bridge what we see as the gaps of security, not just the integration of identity with security technologies to improve your cumulative security spend, but to make you more secure through identity. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership through blogs, webinars as we're doing here today, identity-centric security framework, which is a vendor-agnostic set of best practices, security outcomes, and approaches, customer implementation stories so you can learn from those who have gone before you, and lastly, a virtual community for sharing experiences and validation and providing input into the work product of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. So speaking of the work product, our primary work product of our technical working groups is the Identity-Defined Security Framework, which consists of security outcomes, implementation approaches, and best practices. We make recommendations around best practices and security outcomes. However, we provide multiple alternatives to achieve the desired outcome through implementation approaches, and only you and probably your vendors can determine what approach is best for you. So this is a list of the full library of security outcomes that have been published to date. The goal is to expand on this library as a free community resource. The technical working group team will be adding to the library, but we also want to enlist the expertise of those living and working in the trenches and implementing identity security outcomes to it as well. And I'll let you know at the end how you can get involved. So today, we're going to discuss two of the outcomes focused on governance-driven provisioning and deprovisioning of privileged accounts. So with that, I'll bring Chills and Chris back into the conversation. So why don't we start, Chills, with you, and let's talk a little bit about governance-driven provisioning, so granting privileged accounts and entitlements. Explain to us what it is and why is it important?
So, I mean, I think when you talk about, a governance-driven approach, a lot of companies and a lot of places are challenged out there, right? They have identity systems, there's identities out there, and there's no real way, and there's no, there's no mindset behind, hey, how do we maintain some type of, let's say, a regulatory piece around this, right? How do we validate? Where's the governance piece that the permissions, the entitlements, the privilege that we are addressing, that there's some type of a format that it follows that's trackable, that it's easily to validate, whether it's entitlements, whether it's audit validation, and whether or not people that are getting, the actual privileges that they need to whether do their job or not do their job, how do we attest to that? How do we validate that it's appropriate? And so the piece of the governance provides the outline and the framework to control, in my aspect, all pieces of that, right, if you will. So that's to me, it kind of gives you that framework and that guidance that provides, basically soup to nuts for everything related to privilege and identity.
Great, thanks. So Chris, why don't you talk about the deprovisioning side of things a little bit? So Chris Chills talked about granting. I'm certain that removing privileges that are no longer needed is equally, if not more, important.
Very much so, and that is where the criticality of all of the attestations and the ability to make sure that people who have access, who have been granted the access, have actually been removed that access. That's where I think you're going to see, the biggest kind of gaps in somebody's security model and or their compliance models, where they're not actually going out and removing that access on a timely manner. And Chills mentioned kind of that the framework and being able to make sure that all these attestations are going on. I mean, as he could probably attest, we go into a lot of these organizations today, and that's all being driven mainly by like spreadsheets and just consumption of data. Data's kind of handed out, spread around, and then someone will mark that off, and then you got to still then rely on some type of human to go and remove that access. And being able to have kind of that end-to-end, full audit capability of being able to see that access has been removed is absolutely critical, especially when that user has been deprovisioned or is no longer with the organization.
Excellent. So are there some examples of, breaches are always kind of a touchy subject to hit on. But I'm curious just if there are examples where, you know, this notion of over-privileging an account can create some challenges for organizations and have an end result in a security breach. Or there's some examples of breaches out there that where this particular security outcome might have benefited an organization? And I'll give that one to Chris Arnold.
Yeah, I was going to say, which one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could get specific. I mean, I know we talked about, you know, the Equifax and a couple of other ones that have happened over the years that have obviously affected not only from an enterprise perspective, but most that has also affected all of us who is on this phone and probably those listening from a consumer perspective. And that's one of those situations where, you know, a user has been exposed, or I'm sorry, you know, somebody has some privileged access. The user, you know, has had this privileged access for as long as they have, and they shouldn't have. That should have been removed on a timely basis. That may have even left the organization, and that just leaves that exposure vector there for someone who's an outside hacker to be able to now, you know, get access to that account, utilize that account to then expose data, you know, passwords, whatever it might have been. And those are where it's just super critical that we as an organization, we as, you know, obviously what we're trying to propose from a solution perspective, show that these organizations have to do regular compliance auditing, as well as having the proper procedures and protocols in place to making sure that access is timely removed, utilizing, you know, PAM solutions, IGAs, things like that.
And Julie, to kind of add on to what Chris is saying, look, I mean, you know, statistics are out there. Remote access, and especially now, even more so, continues to be the #1 attack vector, right, for cybersecurity criminals and adversaries. And if you look at the statistics, and let's say unmanaged credentials or privileged credentials that are out there, 80% of privileged credentials are at the heart of cybersecurity breaches. So, you know, they are very much so relevant as it relates to, one, does somebody have too much access? Did they get too much access? And two, as Chris said, if they leave, when they leave, or maybe they didn't leave, maybe they changed different organizations, right? And they still have the access that they had before. Those are just as susceptible and just as bad, you know, for a company and organization as it relates to risk and the risk they need to mitigate.
Yeah, those are all great points, especially with today's world and the work from home environment. Everyone's working remotely. So once again, you're kind of outside of that controlled wall inside that network. Now you're at the Starbucks, you're at the, you know, the local Wi-Fi. You're exposed by what you put into that local Wi-Fi if you don't have the correct VPN software, things exposed. And Chris brought up, or Chills brought up a really good point about transferring job roles. That's a very big problem for a lot of these organizations, that they don't have, you know, their HR system driving their IGA capabilities and maybe spinning up a campaign where someone has to go and verify access because that person has moved from, you know, IT security analyst to, you know, HR or whatever it might be. They need to make sure that those roles that are associated to that user because he was in IT is much different than what he was going to be if he's, you know, moving to HR or somewhere else in the organization.
Yeah, and it's funny, you made me think of another thing, and we talk about, you know, the privilege creep. You know, an identity creep related to individuals. And it brought me back to, you know, when I was at a former company and we were working, and, you know, somebody, let's say, that's been in an organization for an extended amount of time, and they're working and they need access to different systems, right? So they go and they get access, and now they have somebody new that joins the team. And instead of having like a governance process in place that basically only, you know, has that framework to give them only access to what they need, what happens, you know, to Chris's point, they talked about, you know, we're following this with spreadsheets, requests for security groups, and the people that are fulfilling these don't know, you know, if they really need access to it or not. They have a manager that's attesting to it or approving it, and, you know, sometimes the manager doesn't even know. But now you have the individual saying, hey, I need the same access that, you know, Joe does on my team. Can you mimic my access, you know, or copy? And we've seen a huge amount of, you know, privilege creep as a result of that, because Joe, who's been with the company for, let's say, 8 years, has all of this excessive access for what he needs, and now you have a new person coming in, and when there isn't some form of governance around that to mitigate that, that's ultimately what you end up with is this privilege creep, and people having excessive rights that they have no point in having or no reason having.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's something that we see constantly in the world today when we're working with our customers. That's one of the first things they ask is, well, do you just have a copy this user's access? And it's like, whoa, you don't necessarily want to do that, because unless you have a true IGA procedure and policy in place, you can definitely leave yourself exposed. And the other thing that's critical is to not only just be to go and attest to access that people have, but also attest to, if you're using like our RBAC model, role-based access controls, you're attesting to those roles to make sure that they are compliant and should have the access they have. Because like Chris or Chills was mentioning, is that role could have been created 5 years ago, 10 years ago, has kind of been built up over all these years. Well, now nobody's really gone back and said, well, hey, should this role still have all this access? And that's where I think a lot of gaps in security processes have come about.
Yeah,
no, I agree.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Julie. Sorry.
Interject in there. I would guess now, we talked, so access that has been floating around for 5 years or so, and maybe over time has just, continued to accumulate privileges and sort of gotten out of control. But I would imagine right now there's a big challenge with, people are used to being in an office and maybe being able to get access to sensitive data because they are sort of within the confines of their secure environment. But now people are sitting at home on their home computer, accessing financial information or, patient data, or so this sensitive data that can fall under PCI data or HIPPA data or SOX data. I would think that would be a huge problem right now for people. And trying to really kind of keep a tight rein on privilege access.
No, and I agree, absolutely. And it's one of the things that I want to say, it's an afterthought, and probably something that I personally would not want to be a compliance manager in today's world right now with COVID and the pandemic that we're seeing, because I think the compliance piece and the audit piece is coming now after the fact. The dust is starting to settle. People are realizing that the choices that they made and how they're enabling the remote worker and maybe the privileges that they're having to give these remote workers. And now they're starting to realize, wow, did we do the right thing? Can we continue to meet compliance? Can we continue to meet audit and potentially regulatory compliance? And so it poses a new, aspect to the world of, can I pass my audits? Can I still continue to meet? And to Julie, to your point, how are people accessing the stuff there, whether it is PII, whether it is critical information, is that being rendered remotely? Let's say HTML5, and I know we're kind of getting away from the identity piece, but it's a whole different security risk as it relates to companies and organizations that they're faced with and challenged with on a regular basis now.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep moving forward. We could probably talk about this stuff all day. Actually,
I know. Many talking points I could have brought up there, but it's probably a good time to move forward.
Right.
Yeah. So I talked about some research that we did recently. It was actually published in May, called the Identity Security, a Work in Progress. And one of the questions we asked of about 500 security professionals, kind of at all levels, so leaders and strategy and own the budget. We asked them about the frameworks that they're using around security, and probably over half of them are using some form of security framework that might exist out there. And what we want to do is kind of tie this identity-centric security notion back to those commonly implemented frameworks. And so a technical working group team that is focused on the mapping to NIST has done a couple of mappings around the Cybersecurity Framework 1.1, which I think is a fairly well-used framework, as well as the 800-207 Zero Trust. And so how do these particular outcomes map to this particular outcome map to those NIST frameworks? And Chris, Arnold, do you want to jump in there first, and then Chills certainly add where you'd like as well.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
no, especially
Go ahead,
with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1.1. I mean, obviously the key aspects of that are to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? I mean, that's where we're all trying to make sure, and we've kind of already talked about this, but it's being able to make sure that A, we know who has access, B, should they still have access, and C, why were they given access, and it kind of that full loop where it's going to be going through that circle of trust to make sure that this person should have that access and where they are within the organization based on their, job titles, departments, whatever it might be.
Yeah, no, and so, Julie, one of the beauties that maybe some of the viewers might not know, I'm going to go a slightly different path than what Chris did, but being a part of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance, look, I think for those that are looking at frameworks and those that are looking at a lot of these different, models and pieces to go and maybe model their security practices after, there are so many different ones out there that basically apply to different industries and have different approaches and whatnot. But none of them actually have the identity at the center and at the core. And that's one of the great things about the IDSA, right? The people that we have, that we get to work with and that you get to work with, we all share a common entity, and that's the identity. So we're going out, we're looking at the frameworks that are out there, and we're pulling the valid pieces to align what we have. And so for those that are looking at, how do you secure the identities? And to be honest with you, I think the identity should be the focal point of anything because, hey, look, physical security is great and all the other things are great, but if we don't have security measures and framework around the identities, those are what access and people use to access privileged accounts and servers and assets and other pieces, within their enterprises. And so having this and being able to provide, a lot of these references, such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1.1, where it talks about exactly what Chris was saying, where how is it issued, how is it managed, how is it verified, how is it revoked and audited, and then as we kind of teeter into the NIST SP, the 800-207, which is the zero trust, how do we validate that person who's trying to access that data truly is the person that's on the other end? And it kind of takes all of those pieces and all of that groundwork that people could be pulling their hair out and brings it under one roof. And so, huge kudos to everybody that helps participate in IDSA and allowing people to have a place to go to that are looking for the identity-centric pieces.
Yeah, good point about the identity, though, being the central part of the framework, because it is so true that identity is what's going to be the exposure, right? I mean, if that person, uses a bad password, doesn't, or organizations don't implement MFAs or other applications to then, kind of provide that extra layer of security, that identity is what's going to be exposed, and that's what can, cause all the types of issues that we could have with all these breaches and different type of hackings and things like that.
Yeah, I think it was back in 2016 was the first Verizon data breach incident report. I think I have that year right, that highlighted identity as a critical attack vector, as the leading cause of breaches. Compromised credentials, whether it's an insider threat or whether it's stolen credentials or regardless of how you get them, phished or social engineered or whatever, it's that compromised credential and someone going in and posing as that valid user and starting to do bad things. I think, it's been about 6 or 7 years where the data has really proven out that identities are the most vulnerable within your organization.
Yeah, that's why, one of the things that one of the things that we've really seen from an identity perspective is being able to associate risk to that identity, right? So based on their access, based on who that user is, what they may have access to, being able to assign risk scores and risk analytics to that user then helps provide some detail to approvers, to auditors, to whoever that might be making decisions on whether or not this user should have that access based on their risk score within the organization. So that risk analytics is critical within that identity and being able to help with these different frameworks.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting, Julie, you bring up a good point about the Verizon data breach report. And one of the things that, I always try, how do you put a value? How do you put a monetary value on what you're doing and the tools that you're buying to mitigate the risk is worth the investment, right? The ROI, the return on investment. And one of the things that I do often is I do reference the Verizon data breach. And typically in most basic compromises, the statistics are just over about 25,000 records. And so, when we do talk to a lot of people, we try to rationalize, look, if you're not doing something, you're behind the times, but how do you justify to an organization or a board or a CEO that you need to spend money on security tools to help mitigate risk? And I always use the reference in the Verizon data breach. Look, the monetary value is about $152 per record that occurred in the Verizon data breach. If you were to times that by that 25,000 on average records that are compromised, that's $3.8 billion or $3.8 million. Sorry. That to me is like, and that doesn't include the long-term branding, and all the other bad publicity and social media that a company may get or endure as a result of a breach. And so, it's hard to put a value and justify spending the money on and doing the right things, whether it is a identity governance solution, making sure your identities are protected, they're provisioned properly, they're deprovisioned properly. But know that making the strides in the right sense, it's better to be on the good side of not being breached and spending the money to prevent a compromise than it is on the other side. And I think the statistics, whether it's Verizon, whether it's Equifax, or any of the other statistics that are out there, that prove that it's obviously better to be, on the inside rather than the outside in terms of a breach.
Yeah, no doubt. So Chills, while you're at it, let's shift gears a little bit, and I think we've done a pretty good job of justifying the importance of this security outcome and making sure that privileged accounts and entitlements are properly provisioned and deprovisioned. Let's talk a little bit about how this outcome can be achieved. And as I mentioned earlier, we recommend these outcomes, but we give you alternatives to how you should implement them, based on what makes sense given your situation. So why don't you talk through the first approach, which is IGA initiates privileged access provisioning workflow.
Absolutely. So obviously, when it comes time to provisioning, there's work that has to go in, right? You have to be able to define your roles. You have to be able to define policies and whatnot. But ideally, when a new user comes in and that groundwork is laid, right, they put that request into the IGA solution. And because all of the groundwork is already done and all the work is done to create all of these roles and know where all the different lines of business are and how permissions are aligned with that, and the business model, that request for that user comes into that IGA. IGA has the connections and all the pieces. It's kind of like the master, if you will. It has the arms that go out and touch everything it needs to create. It knows where everything is. It has record for where everything is. And one of the things that it reaches out to is a PAM solution per se. So when we talk about the privileged accounts, when you have a user that comes in and they either need access to a privileged account or maybe they need an administrative account of their own that needs access, all of those pieces create this, IGA creates an orchestration, and that orchestration of creating the accounts, vaulting the accounts in a PAM solution, and then being able to show and prove that this person has access to these accounts and that they're put in a PAM solution and they're properly protected, the credentials are properly rotated, and they're not accessible to anybody else for that matter. That's the goal. That's where IGA essentially sits at the heart, and is that orchestrator on the front end that makes sure that everything that it needs to be associated with, it gets associated with, such as a PAM solution.
Awesome. So the second approach is just a little bit of a variation, right? So now it brings in an IT service management solution to kind of handle the workflow element. Is that right?
Yeah, so absolutely. When you think about, all of us have some type of ticketing system. Obviously, some ticketing systems lend itself better to the identity and the IGA side, while as others focus more on let's say, outages. Maybe it's problem tickets, maybe it's trouble tickets related to engineering or architecture. But, in terms of an ITSM system, all it is just an additional mechanism that provides a checks and balance, both from a ticketing system, hey, I'm submitting this ticket, I'm getting approvals through my manager and everyone else that needs to be approved, and then it basically is a handoff to the IGA, right? So it's just a slight iteration, but it still follows all of the same footsteps, if you will, right, and the same process. But now we have this ITSM or this ticketing system that has accountability to the IGA system rather than a direct correlation from the user to the IGA system.
Got it. Okay, we're going to shift then to the removal of accounts and entitlements through this governance-driven process. Chris, do you want to talk through this one? This is automated deprovisioning of a privileged account directly to the PAM solution.
Yeah, no, and Chills, I think he hit it right on when he talked about the automated piece and how IGA is kind of the key piece to all this that's sitting in between, who's doing kind of all the actions, and it's all automated, right? And that's the critical piece. It's all being done. The system, IGA, knows, what access people have, what they shouldn't have, and, when that person, either gets transferred or leaves the organization, that's where it can automatically go reach over to those systems, kind of, remove the access, do what it needs to do on a deprovision event, if that's either, a termination or transfer, whatever it might be, and be able to automate all that, making sure that that is legitimately removed from the user to make sure that that security gap is now being closed.
So on this one, we talk about the life cycle gets initiated through HR. Is that standard? Are there other organizations or stakeholders within this process that might initiate the deprovisioning activity?
I mean, obviously, utilizing your HR system is a great way to first of all, gain some ROI from your HR, since it is the authoritative source of your human resource data. So obviously, having that be the driver is a key component. But you're right, though, because not all contractors, not all temporary workers or whatnot may not be in those systems. So you want to have, you're going to maybe have multiple types of funnel systems that are going to then kind of proliferate that information down to the IGA, which will then obviously extend out to any of its target systems. The other aspect is just, if you have just a request model, right? So it's, the manager knows that this person is leaving, so they request a disablement or a termination for the employee. So it doesn't necessarily have to come from an HR system, but if you can have that automation, that's usually typically kind of a really good way of looking at your source of truth to make sure that, if your HR system is terminating a person, they typically know this person is terminated on this date. That way it will proliferate down and then remove all that access from that user on that day.
So we do have a best practice that highlights the importance of having that single, ideally, right, a single authoritative source. So it sounds like that that best practice definitely is important to this process.
Exactly, and that's where I think there's two sources of truth, right? There's your identity, which we talked about how important that is, and that's really kind of managed by your IGA system. Then you have your HR authoritative source, which is kind of the employee itself, or the contractor, whatever it might be, those systems. But that data is not the identity. That's about the user that can be leveraged to then help build up and structure where that identity resides within the organization, and be able to do kind of, rules-based access governance, things like that, based on, who they are, what groups they're in, where they are within the organization.
Gotcha.
And I think that, Julie and Chris, both of you hit on some really good points. And I think one of the ones that, we probably should stress is the human error element, right? When we don't have an IGA solution, or we don't have something to let's say certify that the permissions and privileges were deprovisioned. And ideally, how many times have you heard somebody saying, oh yeah, I'll take care of that, and they get sidetracked, when you don't have one of those solutions, and they forget, or they didn't go and put the request in to have so-and-so's account removed or disabled. I hear about it all the time, right? And so there's that human factor that having more of this automation piece into it, whether it's giving us reports on entitlements and who has, privilege out there, so we can go, oh crap, I forgot, that needed to be done, or hey, maybe somebody shouldn't have this. We're removing that human element error out of this.
Oh, most definitely. And I think that's one of the things you see a tremendous amount of error within the whole framework of managing your identities is what you just said, which is exposing it to a human element and saying, hey, look, this person needs to go remove this account. And if they don't remove that account, or they don't get to it because maybe they're on vacation or whatever it might be, now you've left yourself exposed that this person was maybe, terminated in a bad way. They're now able to access all their systems because we know everything's, SaaS-based model, so they can, access this stuff from home. So that's where there's a huge vulnerability.
Okay, let's talk about the next one. I think the variation on this one is really just a matter of where the deprovisioning takes place. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, so it's where it takes place, as well as kind of being able to also, the way I kind of also see this is kind of a rules-based approach as well. So, once again, like the person transfers from a certain role or certain department within the organization, you can have the access removed. But it is critical that it is removed from, your Active Directory or your LDAP or whatever it might be, because, one of the strengths of a true IGA solution is having obviously some type of SSO capabilities. So if you were able to kind of decommission that one kind of primary authenticated account, which then leverages that as their IDP for any SAML or OpenID connections, you've now basically choked that user down to where they have to go through a single point of entry to get to any of these other applications. So this is where you can then utilize that capabilities to then really kind of lessen the exposure that if you need to basically, terminate a user or remove their access, you're only really having to go to one single point, or at least, minimize that point of entry.
Gotcha. And then the next one is in the application itself and deprovisioning privileges at the endpoint, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And that's once again kind of goes back to what we talked about, and that's the critical piece of, leveraging your IGA system, making sure that that's your central repository for your identity, making sure that you have as much automation in place as possible, so that way when they do get terminated, it's reaching out and doing the actions on those target systems instead of, relying on some type of human interaction and or, similar to what we talked about, the ITSM and things like that.
Sorry about that. I had a slight slide malfunction. There we go. For those of you that are viewing the slides and paying attention to them, I apologize for that. Okay, and then the last one we'll talk about is a manual process. So I've heard you guys talk so much about how important automating this is and removing the human error. So it sounds like this is certainly an option, and we don't make recommendations. But let's just say that there's a strong leaning of ours towards automating as much as you can. So, Chris, you want to talk about this?
100%. Yeah, I mean, and I think we've talked about it quite a bit. And I mean, obviously, there's organizations out there today that are still leveraging a manual-based system or maybe even a homegrown system. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's obviously something they can do. But there is going to be a point where, and I think Chills brought it up earlier, it's like, okay, well, how much do you want to spend today versus how much you want to spend tomorrow if you do get breached or you do have some type of issue related to security, all because you didn't want to kind of put the money up front today for the automation and or even just a baseline, ITSM checks and balances type system. So there is, maintaining things on spreadsheets and on Word documents and things like that is just, that's only going to take you so far until you get hit and you get exposed, and then all of a sudden you just cost yourself all the money that you could have just spent on a little bit more security system.
Yeah, so thanks for walking through all of that. That's great content, and that is all information that you can find out on our website under the security outcome and implementation approaches. So before we kind of wrap up, Chills, any parting commentary on this particular security outcome that you want to impart on our audience?
No, I mean, as much as I would love, I know we don't give recommendations. If you're not using an IGA solution and you've chosen to do the manual process, make sure that it's thorough. Make sure that, what you're doing. One of the things that I always stress about, and I think people forget about it, is that who's going back? You know what? If you're recording all of this data and you're reporting all of it, who's actually viewing it, right? Who's going back, attesting it, making sure, trying to find the anomalies. If you're not dedicating somebody some way, somehow, to go back and review all of that data that you're collecting, whether it's from an IGA system or whether it's in your PAM system or whether it's in the logs, you're doing yourself a disservice. So, the more you can go back to help protect yourself and mitigate the risks, obviously related to identity, is going to just help your company be further ahead than a lot of these other companies that are out there in protecting themselves against, credential theft, if you will, privileged access theft and breaches. So yeah, that's my parting sense. Chris, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, right? I mean, we've hit the nail on the head about how important your identities are, and I mean, your identities are now obviously employees or contractors or people who are, working for the organization. But then if you're a consumer-based company, you've now got even a bigger exposure to what you could expose out there if you're not doing the right stuff within your security protocols and frameworks to possibly exposing a bunch of consumers, which, as we've talked about already, that's a huge liability and can cost companies millions of dollars. And that's something that I think a lot of these CIOs, CISOs, and others in the organization really need to think through, because there's a certain point of no return. And if you have all this data and you're not mining it, you're not going back and looking at the analytics to make sure that you haven't been exposed. Yeah, there's some definite risk there to not looking at going towards a true IGA PAM solution.
Awesome.
All right, great guys. Thanks. I appreciate you guys being here and all your contributions to the organization.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. It's been fantastic.
So before we wrap it up, I do want to go back to the research that I talked about previously, the identity security, a work in progress. And our research showed that companies who indicated a forward-thinking approach to identity security had significantly fewer breaches. So, of course, the question on everyone's mind at this point is, how do you become forward-thinking? So we recommend these following 5 steps. So first, it's all about discovering your identity types, making sure to include human, so your employees, customers, third parties, and non-humans, application, service, IoT accounts. Then identify the vulnerability and risk associated with each identity type. So with the shift to remote workforce, this may have changed. And you also want to make sure that you understand the risk associated with the data types that you're protecting, especially those sensitive data types that are covered under SOX and HIPPA and the various regulatory compliance. Establish your current state against the identity-defined security outcomes that we recommend and that you can find on our website. Create a roadmap and work with your solution provider and vendors to determine capabilities and identify any gaps. And then, of course, the last one is implement using the desired approach that we've provided on our website, and always want to measure success in achieving those outcomes and ensure that you have hit expectations. So with that, before we sign off, I wanted to point you to those additional resources that supported our discussion today. In addition to the research, we've also got a couple of blogs that I want to point you to specifically that summarizes the study, as well as talks about the changes that we've made to our IDSA framework that we published in May, and how those outcomes and implementation approaches can be used in your organization to become more secure. And then I also wanted to mention how you can get involved. So if you want to comment on the current outcomes that we have published, go to our community forum. And certainly we look forward to your input, and we'd love to have you help us grow our library of security outcomes. And then lastly, I just want to give a plug for the other webinars in this deep dive series. If you're subscribed to our Bright Talk channel, you'll receive emails as new webinars are posted, and make sure to go back and check out the other webinars in the deep dive series. And with that, we hope that you'll join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. Thanks for joining us today.